Kuali Ready webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. While we're beginning here, if you were interested in exploring the Kuali Ready tool, you can click on the trial link we've just shared in the chat window. So this is Becky Higgins. I'm the Kuali Ready Product Manager, and I'm so glad you could join us today. Everyone will be on mute throughout this presentation. We will open for Q&A at the end of the presentation, but please type your questions into the webinar panel as they come to you. We will get through as much as we can in the time permitted. This webinar will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared with you. Feel free to share this link with colleagues who couldn't make it today. You can also download the presentation slides immediately by going to the Handouts section of the control panel now. Before we begin, we would like to make a warm welcome to our newest additions to the Ready community. So please welcome Fresno Pacific University, Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, Georgia State University, Boston University, and Cal State Polytechnic, Pomona. Okay. So I am truly pleased to introduce our presenter for today, Catherine Gottlieb of California State University at Long Beach. Kathy Gottlieb has a wealth of experience identifying and planning around higher ed critical functions in Southern California. As a technology training and documentation analyst at Cal State University Northridge, Kathy's work included developing the IT division's disaster recovery plan and the university's pandemic response plan. A wily IT director took note and voluntricked her into training for and passing the DRII Business Continuity Professional Qualifying Exam. Support and the recommendation of the same director, she was tapped to become the Business Continuity Specialist for Cal State University Long Beach. After a couple of years coordinating the campus's continuity planning program, Kathy happily received her current posting as an IT Program and Project Analyst with the Cal State Long Beach Division of Information Technology. Welcome, Kathy. We're so excited to have you, and you can take it from here.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and thanks so much for the nice introduction, Becky. Hi, everybody. Today, I'm going to take some time and tell you the story of our campus identifying critical functions for continuity planning and identifying them fast without using a BIA or RA. We'll hopefully have time to cover why we started with this quick critical function identification process, how we did it at our campus, what was our framework for rapidly generating our critical functions for continuity planning. Then we'll really drill down on what is contained in our framework, and we'll go through actually the content that we shared with folks on campus to help get them to elicit, to generate, and provide us with their critical functions. And then finally, we'll just chat briefly about how a BIA fits into this approach, or not, or sort of. So we use this outcome-driven approach because for my AVP at the time and myself, we were really driven by a number of necessities. First and most of all, several campus leadership members, they really needed and they wanted a continuity plan fast. And at the same time, continuity planning at our campus is governed by a system-wide executive order, and the EO stipulates very clearly that we're supposed to do planning at the campus-wide level for all of the essential critical functions that are identified at the campus, and also that the campus president is ultimately accountable for continuity planning. So it was, in our estimation, our conclusion was that our campus leadership team really needed to have a way to review and validate critical functions that require continuity planning. And then as a practical matter, we didn't have an edict from on high telling folks you will do continuity planning. And so without that edict, without that written imperative, we really wanted to try to find a way to assign responsible parties for continuity planning by really engaging those members of the campus community and helping them to understand that the responsibility for continuity planning might reside with them, but ultimately rested with the campus leadership. So, and finally, the critical function centric or critical function identification first approach, it just made sense to us given some of our biases. And key among our predispositions was that basically identifying an organization's critical functions, that really is the heart, the basis of the entire process of business continuity planning, the most important aspect in the development of a real continuity plan. Another of our biases was that we just simply believe that there were people out there on campus who could simply list the functions that would be candidates for continuity planning and omit the others, irrespective of whether we did a formal BIA. We also just believed that in an obvious, self-evident, really clear way that these same folks would know what our critical functions are. And frankly, just as a side note, I pretty much believe that for just about any higher education institution, that there are lots of knowledgeable people out there on campus that could easily enumerate, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, 4 dozen basic critical functions that really any higher education institution would need to do continuity planning for. And yes, there are probably others, and those can be identified in a rapid way, perhaps using the same approach that we used at our campus. So we also, though, my AVP and I, we also recognize, though, that, that of course a BIA is supposed to yield and provide stronger evidence that all functions across an organization have been considered for planning, and it might help, a BIA might help to ensure that critical functions are not overlooked. But when we really looked at the level of effort, the time commitment in doing a BIA, we found that it would be very burdensome, drawn out, and actually we thought unproven as a continuity practice, especially for large organizations. So these biases really kind of led us away from the utility of leading with a BIA, and so we were looking for a different approach. We also were led away to kind of develop a different approach based upon just some basic assumptions about continuity planning that we were going to need to apply to our campus. Among them, that campus continuity planning was the focus. We had a little bit of a concern that using the planning tool, which we really like, but if we simply did training on the tool and a little bit of training about campus continuity planning, and then opened up the tool to everybody on campus, we would yield critical functions that might not necessarily really be critical at the campus level. Perhaps they'd be critical at the unit level, at that basic organizational level, but it would end up taking a lot more time then to, in an iterative process, go back and validate those critical functions from the campus point of view. Because remember, our campus leadership wanted us to get to planning right away. And another of our assumptions was that some units would not have functions that would be designated as critical for continuity planning, and so they wouldn't really need to be involved, at least going out of the gate. And so we were looking for a way to target those groups on campus that we would need to do the most outreach with, the most in-depth training. And then finally, one of our assumptions was, well, what is the purpose of a really good list of critical functions and the continuity plans? And we know that we hope that the critical functions and all of the planning around it will help top-level leadership with their decision-making if a bad event occurs. So at root, some of our thoughts were, for example, that a sound critical function list and the plans and the planning framework for a campus could help our senior teams, if a bad event occurred, that it would allow them to redirect resources from non-critical operations to those covered by the continuity plan to expedite recovery. It's kind of a classic use. Or perhaps the framework could support initiation of on-the-fly efforts to give higher priority to operations that maybe were not considered to be critical and weren't covered by the plan. So that was just another one of our assumptions. So what was our framework? So the framework that we ended up establishing and following was to start continuity planning by conducting meetings with campus managers and AVPs in divisions and auxiliaries. But what did we do beforehand? Before we began with those sort of division-oriented meetings, we met with each division VP in advance, and we talked briefly about business continuity. And in some cases, we actually shared some prospective critical function lists. So again, based upon a scan of other higher ed organizations and our best guesses about how our campus culture was, we would share just prospective critical function sort of sample lists for them in our initiating meeting. And then we would get some feedback from the VP about what our next steps would be to reach out to their AVPs and their managers to elicit, to generate these critical functions. Some VPs said, oh, hey, why don't you just come to my meeting that I have with all of my direct reports, and we'll conduct this meeting with that group. Other VPs said, oh, I want you to meet with each of the groups within our division, and so we might have, 6 or 7 separate meetings. So what would happen at these meetings when we would have these AVPs, these managers assembled? Well, during those meetings, we would well, first of all, let me just put you in the room real quickly. So in these rooms, what I would do is I would have a whiteboard if possible, and then I would have a bunch of big blank pieces of paper. Imagine like butcher block paper, that kind of thing. And some of the pieces of paper would be filled out with information that we'll see in subsequent slides, and some of the pieces of paper would be blank. And my AVP and I would tag team in being scribe and being presenter, and we'll see that information shortly. So in any case, we would, during these meetings, present a set of concepts to define and structure thinking about critical functions, really getting people's juices going about thinking about their organization and what their critical functions would be. We would really try to then work with them to identify functions that were considered or known to be mission critical for the campus. Again, the focus is campus continuity planning, that is critical functions as applied to the campus as a whole, not merely to their unit. So any unit, what we would tell folks is, look, any unit can conduct continuity planning for functions that are deemed deferrable from a university point of view. But our emphasis was on campus continuity planning. Also during the meeting, we would, if wherever possible, we really try to obtain designations of the critical function owner. Who's the responsible party that's going to need to generate this plan? Who's going to own the plan? And sometimes, if different, is there somebody else that's going to own the plan as a whole? So as you know, for example, in the Kuali Ready tool, it allows you to identify a bunch of critical functions. Well, you may have a bunch of different critical function owners, but who owns the plan? And so in these meetings, we really went out of our way to try to get that information with all of these kind of VIP important folks in the room so that everybody could be together when these names and these titles are put forth as the responsible owner. Remember, again, we didn't have an edict from on high saying you must do continuity plans, so we thought that this approach really would begin to tie people to their involvement and their commitment to continuity planning. So then we would conclude the meeting, and these meetings would be, they wouldn't be short. They would be 90 minutes to 2 hours easily. And after the meeting, I would go out of my way to get an email attestation of the critical functions and responsible parties from the AVPs, from the VPs, from the GMs, whoever the folks were that were kind of leading the charge for the organization. And what I would do is as soon as I'd get these attestations and this confirmation, that would be my trigger then to go ahead and reach out within these divisions to get those folks planning and to let them know, you've been assigned as a continuity, as a critical function owner. Here's how planning is going to go. Let me introduce you to this really good tool that we have, this Kuali Ready tool, that's going to lead you through it and help you to generate a continuity plan. So again, here I just want to mention that of course we know what a BIA entails, and it's it's a lot of work, filling out forms and surveys and perhaps conducting interviews and meetings, etc. And then someone like me or my AVP, we would examine and report on all of that material. So in terms of the work that's being done, there's still a lot of work to do, even in this fast track approach. The emphasis was a little bit different. It was sort of more of a shared experience, and in a way, I think priming the pump from a kind of a cultural perspective to get people on board with continuity planning and to help introduce them to it and to kind of start binding them again to their ownership, to their role in producing in the plan. So our fast track approach, these meetings kind of, and supplemented with a critical function list, that was our approach. Oh, I'm noticing on this slide there's a little asterisk item that says, as needed, designate critical functions for narrative planning. What I mean by narrative planning is that in a couple of cases on our campus, there were critical functions that were defined, and when we took a look at the online tool, the folks who were doing that planning preferred to produce a written document, more of a narrative style of planning. There were some folks in our research and sponsored program organization that ended up doing a narrative plan. And also for instruction, continuing instruction at our university, the provost opted for a narrative plan because of the types of tools and information that he wanted and his team wanted to be included. So that's what that means. Oh, so what did we say about critical functions during these group meetings, during these divisional-oriented meetings? We started with our general definition of critical functions. It's a dense and wordy definition, and then what we said is, look, we're gonna break this definition down. We're gonna take it apart, and what we're gonna try to do during our time together is to move our thinking from definitional to operational, because what we want, the outcome during our time together is we want to actually produce and identify critical functions that that each unit within the division is going to own and plan for. But this was kind of a good way to get things started. It's sort of that compression of all the components of a definition of what a critical function is. So to begin that breakdown, we began with just a set of principles. Now again, remember I mentioned earlier that to put yourself in the room during any one of these meetings, and we'd have those pieces of paper, we'd have a bunch of whiteboards, and these are the kinds of things that I would write down before the meeting, before everybody came into the room. So they'd enter the room and they'd see some of this information already up on the walls, so that they could even start reading it during our introductions. So again, this set of principles it's basically a broad this, not that structure. A critical function is this, a critical function is not that. And the first principle is it's really an important one, because I think a lot of times when folks are asked to think about the critical functions in their area, they have a feeling that they're being told that some of the stuff they do is not important. So we begin by saying that all campus functions are necessary and important. Everything that everybody does is important to the mission of the university, excuse me. But what we're here to do is to take a slightly different look at all of those necessary and important items, and to say that not every operational, business, or academic activity that is performed can or should be deemed critical if a bad event occurs, and for the purpose of continuity planning. And then we also just try to begin to introduce the concept of the facet of time criticality and value. Those are the things that count when we try to look at what is critical, what must be continued or restored quickly. And then you can see in principles 2 and 3, again, more of that. A critical function is this, not that. And particularly in these two principles, we try to introduce the concept that we're really looking for critical functions that include nouns and verbs. So for example, you might have a department that's environmental health and safety, but the function, but a critical function for that organization might be provide hazardous materials cleanup and disposal, right? So there might be a critical function would not be, and these are examples from our campus. A critical function would not be elevators, walkways, or medical waste, but a critical function might be repairing and maintaining elevators, ensuring access to walkways, providing medical waste disposal. And so this is the way that we would sort of warm up the group to start thinking about their critical functions. And then in the last principle there, we then try to get near the concept of the RTO, again, without using the term RTO. So we also then start providing some thought starter questions, and among key among those questions is under what circumstances, or what are the activities that must be performed by your unit under normal routine circumstances? In other words, what services must your unit provide to campus constituents? And then usually what I do is I go through kind of a little bit of a litany of questions. And so a few of them for the group would be, what activities under normal conditions must be performed by your department or unit? In summary, what does your unit do routinely? What action words accurately describe the purpose for your department? Again, going back to trying to get folks thinking about linking verbs with nouns, right? Your department performs a bunch of operations. What is and must be provided to your campus as a result? Or simply, what service or services does your department provide? And overall, these questions are just, again, trying to drive folks in the room to start really thinking about what are the most important academic, administrative, and business activities performed by the unit. And then also just to start getting them thinking, well, what would happen if these activities could not be performed? Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe which would indicate that the activity is deferrable. Maybe it would be kind of perilous. Okay, that might indicate that the activity should be considered as a critical function. So after this sort of general kind of discussion, then we kind of zero in on, okay, well, what are some of the potentially, well, not quite checklist, but some of the firmer statements we can say about what does make a function critical. We try to get down to some of the brass tacks for them to start thinking about, and just to have them start thinking that, as a rule of thumb, we would consider a function critical if it's absolutely essential for teaching or research, or for the operation and administration of those types of functions. Yeah, and I'm sure that many of these items are rather familiar to you. As an example, where you see is required by law or regulatory authority, one of my favorite examples to use there is for our Center for International Education. They do answer to, my understanding is, to the Department of Homeland Security for what they call CFs reporting, which is reporting on folks who are studying at our campus but who are from abroad. And the nuance there is there room from a legal or regulatory point of view, is there much room for an exception? If there's not much room for an exception for these legal or regulatory requirements, then that would bring that function into the critical area. So again, when we discuss the RTO concepts, we try to discuss them without using or dwelling on the term RTO, because we found that it can sometimes blow people's minds about talking about RTO. But of course, it's really essential to ground the critical function discussion within such a fundamental concept of business continuity. So we try to ground it into just the concept of time criticality. So we kind of use that as a substitute, and we focus on questions like, can the function stop at all? And if so, for how long can the function be deferred? The other type of thing that I try to talk about in this area is that many groups are already identifying critical functions and in fact conducting a bit of continuity planning. They may not recognize it as so. So I really try to call that to their attention and give you an example, and I'm sure some come to your mind as well. The classic example is when someone might need to leave for a maternity or paternity leave. People are doing a little bit of continuity planning. Who's going to take care of this or that while their colleague is away, right? And so the thought starter questions there are, what events have disrupted unit operations over the past few years, and what was done when those disruptions occurred? And for how long were those mitigations needed to be put in place? And another way to come at this idea is, what kinds of preparation or planning or monitoring, if any, does the unit conduct during long holiday breaks? At our CSU, we shut down between Christmas and New Year's, and there are certainly a number of units on campus that have to take really, in effect, continuity planning action to make sure that perhaps certain transactions or certain activities are covered, or they have to make sure that they can suspend operations for that time and then restart right after the new year. So again, just underscoring that continuity planning might actually be taking place already, and that will really go directly into helping to identify some critical functions. So another area that we would cover in these meetings while we're trying to elicit all the critical functions for these division units is trying to make sure that we help people not include too much and not include too little, and kind of meet that Goldilocks challenge, which, that's a tall order. So how do you meet that challenge? Well, we encourage folks to consider indirect relationships. So some functions may appear to have only an indirect relationship to instruction or research, but nevertheless, those functions might be critical if stopping them or interrupting them would have a significant negative impact on the campus's ability to carry out instruction or research. So, we try to bring up that notion of indirect relationships. At the same time, we also bring up the idea that, look, we're going to set the bar high. All of us together are going to set the bar high when determining what is critical. Because if something really, really bad happens for some length of time, we might all be working in a portable unit with a bunch of extension cords and a few computers. And so we'll really need to be very decisive about, well, what is critical? Where are we going to start? What are we going to do to bring operations back up? And we also want folks to feel comfortable that they can and they should make a clear judgment about whether or not a function is critical. What's kind of interesting in these meetings is that where you have these AVPs and these managers in these meetings, they're able to say, oh, I think this or that is a critical function in my area, and depending upon the collegiality in the group, very often you'd have their peers say, asking really good questions and saying, is it really critical, or have you thought about this, or even adding to things, well, what about this? We think that this function actually is critical. So you have kind of that nice cross-pollination at times. So another reason why this fast track approach we thought yielded some useful results. A tip for avoiding over-inclusion, a lot of times people would say, well, we do HR, we do purchasing, we do a lot of these things in our unit, but every unit does these things. So what we did is we just said, look, we're going to do continuity planning at that highest level. We're going to designate that critical function as belonging to one controlling unit. So as a practical matter, on our campus, we designated the critical function of paying people and hiring people with the HR units or the faculty affairs hiring group. And similarly with purchasing, it's true every unit does their purchasing, but they have to submit all of their purchases to our centralized purchasing group. So therefore, from a continuity planning point of view, the critical function of purchasing owned by one group, planned for by one group, and in the event of something really bad happening, that purchasing group, for example, could then let everybody know on campus, here's what we're going to do for the next 2 weeks or 2 months or more in terms of handling purchasing. And then the veiled critical function, that's a little trickier, but because our process was rather iterative, and by that I mean that after we did this high-level meeting within the division, then I would go out into the field and do planning and training on the tool with the local groups, and then I could talk to them a little bit more and see if there were any kind of hidden critical functions that might need to be brought to the fore. One example that comes to mind is our accounts payable group. I noticed an aspect in their 3 or 4 critical functions within accounts payable that electronic banking or ensuring electronic banking access seemed to be a theme that ran through all of them, and with just a little additional questioning, it became clear to all of us, the AP group, and to me that maybe that should be teased out into an additional critical function. So that's an example of a veiled critical function. Also, real quickly, I'm going to take a little extra time on this slide just to give you a couple more examples of the type of principles that we're talking about here. So for this, the example for making a clear judgment about what's critical and not, when I worked out at Cal State Northridge, the critical function of resuming access to transcripts, that was a slam dunk, incontrovertible, patently obvious critical function for that campus. And when I came to Cal State Long Beach and on our perspective list of critical functions, I of course included the making sure transcripts is available critical function. Our enrollment services AVP at the time looked at that, and in his clear judgment, it was exactly the opposite. No, transcripts are not a critical function. We won't be planning for that. So that's a really interesting, that's just one example of, okay, there's a clear judgment. The culture is different. Priorities might be different. Also, the thoughts of how that function might be resumed. Maybe the details there are that it's very straightforward for them to resume it. But again, that reflects that kind of a clear judgment. For the notion that can a critical function suffer a significant interruption, I like this example a lot. we have a beautiful Japanese garden on our campus that's administered by our University Relations and Development Group. When we met with them, the folks there initially identified access to the Japanese garden as one of their critical functions. After some robust discussion, they decided that in fact the fish can die, that the koi fish can die, and that the trees might have to be sacrificed and the plantings might need to be sacrificed, and that really access to the Japanese garden did not rise to the level of being a critical function from a campus-wide perspective, and that in fact it could be interrupted for 30 days or more. So I thought that was a really interesting example, because clearly at the unit level there were really strong feelings about it being critical, but when putting that campus overlay from a campus perspective, even though it's painful, even though it would be painful to lose the garden, that might be the kind of choice that might need to be made. And then in terms of the principle of directing or controlling a sufficient level of instruction or research or service, this is an interesting example too. In the Student Affairs Group, they provide a service of childcare for students. There's a place where students with kids, they can sign up and bring their kids over for childcare. And again, after some robust discussion, it was decided that the campus-provided childcare service would be deferrable. That in fact, while there was a dependency for the 60 or 90 families that depended upon the childcare, that could be a deferrable function. Again, even though there would be a consequence for that 60 to 90 families, from a continuity planning point of view, from a campus point of view, we might need to defer that if a really bad event happened. So again, I'm hoping that those examples help give you just some perspective on the types of choices or decision making. Oh yeah, so as we've seen, there likely would be some hazards and pitfalls using this approach, and so we'll just go through a few of them rather quickly. You would want to really be careful and construct your definition of a function and a critical function for these types of meetings and for these types of audiences, and depending upon the sensitivities of the folks that you're meeting with, introduce concepts of RTO very carefully, because people can get confused, or they can kind of get hung up on some of the details, and then it can be harder for them to break into and find what their critical functions are. There can also be some sensitivities about the distributions of critical functions among units. I kind of alluded to that earlier, where some people will feel funny or uncomfortable if they're in these meetings and critical functions are being identified and they don't have a critical function that ends up being deemed necessary for continuity planning. And so then just to reinforce those principles from earlier before, that of course everything that the campus does, all of the functions are necessary and important, but from a continuity planning point of view, just simply from if the worst happens, we would just need to have a set of operations where we would begin, and of course over time we would come back to all of the important and necessary functions. Also, sometimes in the meetings there was this temptation to rank order functions rather than classify them, rather than classify a bunch of functions as critical, a bunch of functions as deferrable. Rank ordering meaning this is function A is the most important, function B is the most important, and yet they're both critical. That can end up being really tricky, because in one room you might have one type of rank, in another room or under different circumstances the rank order is going to change. So really nip that in the bud when that comes up, and instead emphasize the idea of classification, that you have buckets of functions and they're all kind of living in there in each of their buckets. There also can be certain tension points about who really has the planning responsibilities for certain critical functions, because there might be perceptions about interdependencies and who really owns what. And I don't really have a pat or firm answer for that. That's really something that sometimes will have to be negotiated and investigated a little bit further. But the sooner that your antenna can be up about that and be sensitive to that, the sooner that you can kind of table that and say, oh, well, why don't we take that offline, or it looks like more discussion needs to be conducted, and we'll make a note of that so that you can continue to advance the discussion while everybody's in the room. And then finally, I'm just going to mention this is just a little pet peeve of mine now that I'm so ensconced in the world of information technology. I really feel like it should be okay for continuity planners to go ahead and sort of make a bit of a declaration when folks start going down the road of, well, when is IT going to have our internet connection ready, or when is IT going to have our computers available, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's really important to help people understand that continuity planning is not waiting for information technology to bring the campus back up to functioning within the IT realm. That there's a lot that can be done and a lot that must be done to restart critical functions. So one way that I would try to talk about that is to talk about the sort of, for a period of 1 to 30 days, depending upon the criticality of your function, you may have to go back to the Stone Age. And so you may need to use pen and paper and written forms and to prepare in that way. What if IT can't really come to the rescue as soon as you would like them to? They're going to be working on all kinds of things, again, from a campus-wide level. And so if there are things that you need at the local level to take care of your campus-wide functions, you need to be ready to carry the water for a little while IT is working on everything from the campus perspective. So that I know that's a little bit of editorializing there, but I really feel strongly that that can sometimes turn into quite an impediment for continuity planning at non-IT units, is this notion that really they can't do their continuity planning until or unless IT brings them back. And so these next steps, I imagine, are quite familiar to you because they really do echo, in a way, the Kuali Ready software. And again, it's actually one of my favorite parts of the Kuali Ready tool, is that it really provides this very useful structure that is, in and of itself, in my opinion, it's actually training. So I can do a bunch of training for the Kuali Ready tool, and then when folks go into the tool, it's this exact echo and almost repetition of so much of the stuff that we have talked about. So it's sort of this self-reinforcing process. All of those next steps. So let's see. Oh yeah, that brings us back and finally to the BIA as a tool for critical function identification. And perhaps you've been able to tell I am a bit of a skeptic when it comes to using a BIA and RA as a tool for critical function identification. Certainly that was how I was trained in business continuity planning through DRII, and it seems to be, that traditional classic way of conducting continuity planning. But I think I'm of the mind that a BIA doesn't really help identify critical functions, and so then as a practical matter, getting people into the tool to identify these critical functions, the approach that we took really helped folks on our campus to really get down to the brass tacks of let's get those plans going. And I was happy to see that these two gentlemen, Rainer Hubert and Jim Mitchell, seemed to share that point of view and talked a little bit more about it in their pieces. And I'm just going to read, just to conclude really quickly, I'm just going to mention something that Mitchell says. He says, months and countless man-hours are spent creating, distributing, completing, collecting, and analyzing the results of BIA surveys. The result? Dubious data containing both fact and fiction, and charts and graphs of extremely questionable value. So what's the solution or alternative? Now I'm going to take Mr. Hubert and Mitchell to task because they don't answer that question. And I don't have an answer really for that question, except to say years ago we went this slightly different way to get our critical functions identified and get into planning. So I hope that gives you a little bit of food for thought. And I will go ahead then and see if folks maybe have questions or comments. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing how you apply your methodology to creating critical functions at your institution. Attendees, please take this opportunity to submit additional questions. Also, feel free to submit a question even if you want a personal answer. Just note it as private and we can get back to you directly. Okay, first question, Kathy. What do you mean by a narrative plan versus what Kuali would produce?
Oh yeah, I can expand on that a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, when we identified critical functions, there were a couple of functions that were deemed not as good a match with the Kuali Ready plan. In the case of our research and sponsored programs group, they identified a critical function, if memory serves, something about ensuring safety of lab animals and lab specimens, I think something like that. And as a practical matter, they really wanted to drill down on certain types of protocols for restarting or maintaining that function. And the Kuali Ready system, it allows you to upload documents, but in terms of the actual, like the template-oriented pages, it didn't really meet their needs for that critical function. So in lieu of that, we just had them write out those documents, those worksheets, those checklists, and that comprises their continuity plan. Similarly, on the instruction side, the way that our campus has done continuity planning for instruction is, remember how I mentioned that trying to assign a critical function at the highest controlling level? Well, it's true that instruction is done at all of our colleges and in all of our classroom courses, but the highest controlling level really is through the provost's office. So the campus opted to do planning for the continuation of instruction through the provost's office, so just one plan for that. And again, because there were a number of different documents and a number of different statements that needed to be compiled about how instruction would be continued, and they didn't quite align with the Kuali Ready set of templates because it's kind of a different approach. We compiled those documents, the provost's office and the folks they assigned, they put together that document set. And so that document set, I refer to it as a narrative type of plan. So I hope that gives you a flavor for what that means.
Next question. Do you subcategorize critical functions in less than 30-day increments, like critical 1, critical 2, critical 3, etc.?
We do categorize, yes, we do categorize the critical functions in terms of when they might need to be recovered. And I think one of the one of the handouts, if you take a peek at critical function, is that critical function guidance? Is that the one? One of the handouts includes the basic categories that we used kind of the buckets within those 30 days, and then also a little bucket for what's deferrable and kind of a definition of what is a deferrable function. So I invite you to take a look at that. And the only other thing I'd say about that is that that little handout is from many years ago. Well, we were one of the very first campuses to use the old version of Kuali Ready back when it was a tool that was developed by UC Berkeley. And so the categories that you'll see in the handout are not the strict four categories that I think are reflected in the Kuali Ready tool today. I think there might be 5 categories, but they're easily adjustable, but at least it gives you a general sense of how we establish the buckets, and you can see some examples there.
Next question. How have you addressed research continuity versus administration or business or academic continuity? Sorry, I forgot. I didn't hear the first part of the question. How have we addressed? So I think they're asking research. About how you've dealt with the different categories of plans on your campus.
But I'm hearing the question as focused on the research.
I will restate and let's see what we think together.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Becky. Sorry, folks.
No. How have you addressed research continuity versus administration/business or academic continuity?
Got it.
More clearly spoke this time.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that it is a research continuity question. The focus of our CSU campus is, while there is an important and significant research aspect to our campus, we are not a research university akin to UCLA or UC Berkeley. Nevertheless, from the research continuity, that would be again through our Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, and the most critical function that was identified was the one that I mentioned earlier about making sure to protect lab, and again, I might be misstating it because I don't have it in front of me, but protecting lab specimens and lab animals, I think, and that's the one that we really focused on. But to that point, in terms of encouraging all academics on our campus and all researchers to develop their own continuity approaches and protocols to save their research, when I was in that role as continuity specialist, I definitely tried to do outreach at the individual level, and whenever I had an audience with folks on the academic side, to really encourage that type of awareness and that type of action at that level. But in terms of having a more formal approach, that was about the size of it, that one critical function that was done in a narrative style.
Okay, this is for me. I'm really curious. Our previous webinar, we talked about kind of a top-down, president-driven approach to buy-in on campus. And what I heard you say is that you had this approach where you wanted a greater long-term buy-in for participants by using your fast track, really meeting-oriented, relationship-building approach. Do you feel, or have you experienced both of those and know whether one approach is more useful in your experience?
Oh, that's a good question, Becky, because when I was at Cal State Northridge and was just fresh out of the continuity planning training that I took, I had the benefit of, when I returned to campus, my director, the director that voluntricked me into this whole stuff, this whole continuity world, he had somehow spoken with the president out at Northridge, and she had written a one-sentence statement, which I do not have, unfortunately, lost to time, that said to everyone on campus, if you own a critical function, for continuity planning, you are responsible for annual development and maintenance of a continuity plan for Cal State Northridge. And that was gold. That was my golden ticket to really make sure that folks would come to me and ask me, well, what does this mean? What are our next steps? It could really develop partnerships really quickly. It could really engage folks up and down the sort of the chain of command. So that definitely came in very, very handy. And if you can get that, that's terrific. I didn't have the same thing at Cal State Long Beach, so my AVP and I, that's, again, one of our big motivations for trying to come up with a way that over time we would have a better chance of up and down the line really helping people understand that it was really a community effort and really kind of a sort of this cultural effort over time, and then just see what happened. So I was redeployed to IT, quite happily. So I really am not able to say what would have happened, because the position, I was only in the position for a little while, and and there's no one in that position right now. So, but I can say that people still bring me their continuity questions, and there, and it goes in ebbs and flows. There are waves where people are very interested and want to do the continuity planning. So it's there out there in the culture. So what I would prefer, of course, is just a one sentence, a one-liner from the president. That's very helpful. But if you can't get it, you can make gains, I think, using some type of an approach that's similar to the one that we just reviewed today. I think it's worth taking a chance on it.
Great. Okay, Kathy, again, a huge thanks for preparing and presenting today's webinar. This was fantastic.
My pleasure.
Attendees, be sure to grab the attached presentation and handouts if you want them immediately. Kathy has been kind enough to share her documented guidance on creating critical functions, so take advantage of that. Otherwise, this recording will be emailed to you. Thank you all for attending this webinar, and have a fantastic day. Bye.